late summer 928,888,888. The lean month was on them, the time between midsummer and harvest. Fortunately for the people living on Sainid's land, there had been no raids so far, so the population could eke out their winter stores, supplementing their diet with prosperous herring catches. Osrith, on one of her daily dawn patrol of the lands, noticed the lone figure riding from the northwest and met him, tagged Sikhs to hand, at the ridge of land north of the Two-Eyed. It was Eswi. He had come with the same summons as the hapless messenger had come with a fortnight before. "I will tell you what I have told the fool you sent. I will not go to Dunnottar," Osrith said, stubbornly. "I have land and people who rely on me." But Eswi's presence was not unwelcome. Indeed, she invited him back to the hall and Badria, the kitchen maid, to prepare food from what they had. "If not for Constantine, then for your son?" Eswi asked, tucking into the smoked herring and stonies, made from crushed root vegetables and baked on stones in a hot fire. "Is he well?" Osrith asked, at once. "He misses you, surely," Eswi told him. Osrith was pacing the kitchen again, slowly, and looking out of the window. He had never seen her like that before, and wondered as to the grief she must be suffering. "Then he can be sent here, as I asked, when Sainid and I ... When Sainid," Osrith broke off, and Eswi ignored his platter that came tumbling to the stone floor in his haste to approach her. For she was crying. Osrith barely cried, in fact, she could not remember the last time she had done so. But these tears were born of guilt, of her reluctance to come to Berwick, to labor here under duress with the appreciation of the love that her husband showed her mean recompense. Guilt from leaving her inexpert managing of the farmlands, which Mund, the estate's manager and ancient friend of Sainid, never complained about, but from what Osrith could tell created more work for him, to do what she did best, and fight, a selfish indulgence, she knew, when her responsibilities were at Berwick. The people had, over the years she had been there, inexplicably worked their way into her heart. And if she were to leave now, when there was no lord for them to serve, what would become of them? This is what she told Eswi, as he sat beside her and comforted her. "I will leave, I will tell him," Eswi told Osrith. "But please, I beg you to reconsider. The king wishes for you to tell him of your grief." And Osrith watched as her friend left, over the ridge of hills that led to Melrose Monastery and away to the southern banks of the Forth. But that was not the end of it. A week later, just as the people were preparing for the harvest, and as Osrith rode her horse in the dawnlight on the perimeter of Sainid's land, she heard shouts from behind her. It was Kaltigar, Mund's son, and he too was on a horse, riding with haste towards her. "Vuz!" he shouted, not looking at Osrith directly, but to the west, along the course of the Two-Eyed. And he was right. A dozen or more men were riding in haste in their direction, and her farms would be the first to be hit. Bastards! They knew exactly when to strike, when the farms were beginning to fill. "No," Osrith told herself, "my people's hard work will not be what you steal." She had no sword now, and though she had thought about replacing Buie, lost at the battle in which her elder brother had won Bibbenberg, it was not something she had prioritied. A mistake, a damned mistake, Osrith told herself, although nothing could be done about it now. "Go back, boy," she told Kaltigar. "Tell your father to get the men, bring reaping hooks, bring axes, defend their homes, burn the harvest before these cunts get it." Kaltigar reined his horse, which tottered on the spot as he turned him. But he looked over his shoulder once more, counting the figures. "They will get to the eastern farmland first," Osrith told him. "Get your father to defend there, and then leave them. Ride over the river and get the southern farms to dig in their harvest, the women and children. Send the men north." "We will stop there," she broke off as she looked back at the bastarders, thieves, outlaws as they were, who raided farms in Northumbria and Pitland, Strathclyde and Cumbraland. The families had grown rich and lived in strongholds in the centre of the land. And Vercourt was killed instantly, such was their scourge on farmland in all directions. But these were not rivers. One of the riders was carrying King Constantine's sigil, and had now slowed when they saw the two figures on horseback. "I am not going," Osrith thought, sheathing tagged Sikhs. As she glimpsed faces she knew, nuanced scarred teamers and seen Z Malcolm, King Domhnall's son, riding next to his cousin, Selark, Dubkan and Drostan, the Morma's sons who she had trained and had guarded her before her wedding to Sainid Angus, of course, Constantine's general, Baldred, his squire, and Felim. And next to him, and 4 other warriors, was Eswi. Without a word, or any sign of acknowledgement of her former comrades, Osrith turned her horse and rode down the ridge, and onto the brief, low-lying land at Berwick. She crossed the pack-horse bridge to the southern bank, where the fisher cottages were, and headed west, back to the farmhouse. Caltigar had followed her, and stood outside the door when Osrith slammed it shut, a weak, if determined bulwark to the Albo army which had followed them. "Move, boy," Angus told Caltigar. "Your mistress must hear us." "I will move when she commands me," Caltigar replied, his frame almost as large as Angus. It would be difficult to judge who would come of better in a fight, which is where it was heading, with Caltigar reaching for the wood axe by the door frame and Angus's blade scraping in its scabbard. "Wait," Eswi told them both, "for, rather than force, something else might do the persuading." He strained his eyes to the hall table, before which he had sat a week or so before, and to the object on it. Osrith did not see it immediately. She paced before the fire that Rhea was making. The young woman's face was crumpled with concern, both for her mistress, and at the rumour, which had caught faster than the fire that Osrith had planned, that the Scots had come to take her by force. "Did anyone come to the hall this morning?" Osrith asked Rhea in Cymric, as the girl moved the wood basket, and made to kneel before the blaze, leather screen in hand. "No, mistress," she told Osrith. "No one at all?" "None that I saw," she told her. "Better if you ask Mund. He was here just after you left. I am sure I heard him speaking to someone." But it did not come to that. As Osrith was contemplating diffusing the tension at the front door of the hall, between ever-loyal Caltigar and the UN-bending Angus, she saw it. The table, containing Osrith's work basket of failed items, lavender from the northeast coast field and the butter churn she was having better luck at mending, contained something else, something more. She looked more intently, looking at the fire irons and roasting spits, but amongst them, something gleamed, long and pointed. At first, she could not discern what it was, or even that she was looking at it all. But the work was unmistakable. The hilt, over which she had run her fingers so many times, contained the symbols of Gales and Britons long past. Her eye caught the Triskelion, the 3 curled branches of a circle that could even be found on the stones in Pitland, and on the Gaelish Ogham stones. Bué lay on her hall table, as if she had been placed there by Osrith herself, as if Osrith had never been without her. As she reached to touch her sword, she heard a gasp from Rhea, who dropped the cooking forks into the hearth. Osrith turned. A man stood in the threshold of the back door, 1 foot in, 1 out. Finan. He looked at Osrith, unmoving, until Osrith picked up Bué. "What does he want?" she asked him. Finan frowned. "Osrith," he began. "My brother," Osrith demanded. "Why did Utad of Bibbenberg send you?" Rhea scuttled behind Osrith as her one-time tormentor, then lover, father of her son, took a few steps into the hall's kitchen. "No, Finan shook his head. "I have not come from Lord Utad, although he sends his wishes." Osrith felt her face grow hot. "Wishes my land did not border his," Osrith retorted, and then, from the look on Finan's face, regretted it. And then Finan turned, opening the door at the front of the hall, where a standoff was taking place between Angus, sword raised, and Caltigar, equally determined to do as much damage as he could with the wood axe, if it came to it. Osrith gave him a narrow-eyed look as she pushed between the potential combatants, only turning back when Finan called, "Osrith." She turned back, Bué raised. Of course he would send you rather than come himself," Osrith called to him. "What is it he wants, then?" "Osrith," Finan declared, and made to follow her, but heard Caltigar hiss, "Bastard Vaz." As he passed. Though untrue, Finan turned in at the barb in his striding after Osrith. Caltigar's face changed from steely determination into rage. at the thought that he had found a thief after all, and made to go after him, but Angus kicked the axe from his hand. "Whatever it is, tell him no, Finan," Osrith shouted back. She was nearly to her steed. If she could only be away, run away, it would be all right. She had farmers to see. "Well, that seems conclusive," Angus commented to Phelim, who gave his fellow Mormor a grin as they saw Finan stop walking and glare at them. "The bastard set his sights too high in our captain." "Watch out," Phelim told Angus, not caring to disguise his comments by talking quieter. Eswi, however, fell from his horse and landed with a thump on the ground, and hurried after Osrith. "Stop!" he demanded, and ran after her as Osrith picked up her face. "Osrith, stop. You need to know why we are here." He threw her hand away from her rein, and made her turn to look at him. She gave him a defiant glare. "Do you not understand why Constantine wants you to return to Dunnottar?" he asked her. "To remove these lands from me," Osrith told him. "Constantine must come and tell me himself that Sainid's lands are for Efiat, otherwise, I will manage them myself." She made to struggle in Eswi's hands, but the spy held her wrists. "No," Eswi told her. "The king has granted the wish that man," and at this, he nodded to Finan, who was halfway between the Alberguard and themselves, "has requested, which is to fulfill his oath to you." His oath, Osrith thought, her fight ebbing in her arms. "His oath, to me? Which is why we are to return to Dunnottar, why Constantine has asked you to come back," Eswi told Osrith. But, if she had heard his words, Osrith did not show it. Panic, now, filled her chest, and she looked around at the landscape, the wheat fields that would soon be cleared, the sheep in the meadow. "I cannot leave Berwick," she told him, glancing to Finan. "What will become of the people who depend on my as she broke off. Eswi wishes for you to remain here." To put a hand on her arm. "We ask that you come in procession to Dunnottar for the Ullaid warrior to fulfill his oath to you. King Constantine has agreed that you are then free to return here. And your son may come too." But Osrith shook her head, and bent to her friend. "He would not do this willingly. Something is in it for him." "Of course," Eswi laughed. "Your brother is your neighbor. You overlook the sea to the east. Constantine wants what he has always wanted, and if he gives you his land, he is saying in effect, he owns the land south of Culdis to Berwick. In the tripartite alliance that Constantine agreed to with King Edward, the Wessex king has interpreted that he now has lordship over Northumbria, as well as Mercia. As far as he is concerned, this is Northumbria, Bernicia as was, to the fourth." He glanced over to Finan. "Oh, and the warrior wishes to marry you, and Constantine has agreed to it." Marry her. It was a word that Osrith had never thought possible, especially since she had said yes to Sainid. Eswi, as if reading her thoughts, added, "What would Sainid want you to do?" And she knew, Osrith, who had been through so much, had done so much and was now clinging to guilty memories that were motivating her to remain at Berwick. She knew exactly what the big-hearted, kind warrior, who had loved her so dearly, would want her to do now. Finan, however, had clearly taken this as a refusal, and was walking away, to a white horse which had been tied by its rein to a tree. Osrith stepped from her own horse and from Eswi and took a few steps towards him, stopping at the path that led to the farm's hall. "Finan more!" Osrith shouted, and she waited for him to turn. Then, she lay Buay down in front of her, on the scrub, before her feet. "I thank you for returning my blade. It is dear to me." He nodded, but said nothing. "He comes in peace," she told the Alba men, who knew that, of course, and then said it again in Cymric for the benefit of the Pitlanders amongst Berwick's estate, who had gradually been coming to the farm's hall, on hearing that an army from Alba had come to threaten their mistress. "Finan more!" Osrith called again. "You came here to ask me something." "Ask it." And the words hung between them, like a wave smashing into rocks, drops of moisture clinging to the surface. The words were still there between them for what felt like many minutes after she had spoken them. And Finan turned, pulling himself up onto his unsaddled horse, and looked to Osrith as if he were riding away. But instead, he turned the white beast and moved towards her, addressing her from its back. "I am Finan you Akin Chopper," he said without shame, and I wish to accompany you to Dunnottar fortress to tender a proposal to King Constantine. And I am Osrith Ui Alpin, widow of Sainid Ui Alpin. Osrith replied, late cousin to the king. I will, by the grace of King Constantine, move to accept the proposal. She nodded, and Finan bowed from the back of the horse. Well, that's settled, she heard the voice of Eswi say, and he turned and translated this to the people of the farm who had now moved closer to Kaltigar, listening to the foreign Gaelish words. Osrith turned too, and watched their faces, in full acceptance that the king of their land was negotiating a new lord to be installed in their lands, and their lady would remain. At the declaration that the new lord was likely to be Finan, they looked at him, unmoved. Then Osrith turned to Mund. This is a busy time, and a dangerous time to leave the land, she told him. And I know that you and your son will manage to bring in the harvest. She turned to Angus. I am leaving my estate with 5 of your men, with the intention that they serve King Constantine by offering my people protection. Please select your best. A flinch of obsequence flashed over Angus's face. He had never liked Osrith taking the role of captain. But he did as she had commanded, and Timas, Senzi, Baldred, Heribald and Bran were summoned to stand beside Mund and Kaltigar. And then Angus raised his arm assembling the rest of his men, then lowered it, signaling that the army should march onwards. Finan, with a smile to Osrith, pulled himself up on his white horse, and Osrith mounted her own. After a moment, she saw Kaltigar, who had hurried up to the horse's left flank and was holding out Buet to her. My thanks, she told him, wondering at how easy it had been to forget her blade, after no more than 6 weeks of losing her. Ginevrian both, Kaltigar told Osrith, and bowed his head. It wasn't until much later that Osrith realized that her Cymric family, that of Arian, was not only known to the families here, but valued. They must have been descendants of the Britons who had fought for Arian, or against him, at Ketrith, as the Briton Allah had once told her, when she had nursed her wounds inflicted by Ethelwald, who had told them. Sainid? It must have been. Osrith nodded back, and then looked to the elder warriors. Already Angus was leading the men to the hills whence they had come. Finan waited for the line to pass, and he drew back to where Osrith rode, saying nothing. They exchanged smiles, then Osrith asked about her brother, allowing him to speak rather than making bold assumptions, and they rode together, following the warriors. And he told Osrith that Utad was well, and his son had joined him, his younger son Utad, rather than Father Oswald, and that the men had been busy refortifying Bibbenberg as he had left. He had astonished her by saying that he had ridden to Constantine and seen young Finan. He is well, Finan told him. He looks like my cousin. He was a Skilioct too. A storyteller, Osrith knew, a law speaker. A person with such a memory and gift of language and music and rhyme that histories of a people would be told, on feast evenings, or to children. Beowulf was one, as the English and Saxons knew, and the Gaels told of others, of the cattle run of Cooley, and of Neil, so powerful that he could command 9 hostages, 1 from each of the 7 Saxon kingdoms, and from Cymru, Wales, Deheubarth, and Aberfraw. After some time, out of propriety, or perhaps something else, Angus of Fortriu held back his horse and got between them, nodding to Finan to take his white horse to the back of the column. They neared Bicker's monastery of Melrose, where he had grown and learned to be a priest, and as Eswi spoke to the abbot, the men taking their horses to be stabled and tended, Osrith crossed to Finan, and they crossed to a clearing, away from her chaperones. Why did you come? Osrith asked. Because I love you, Osrith, and I want to marry you, Finan told her, taking her hand. You are free to marry, and Bibbenberg is one. Now, he added, looking at her, seriously. I know you may yet turn me down, or the king might intervene. I tried to kill you when we were children. I gave information that made people, your brother included, treat you terribly. But, hear me when I tell you, Finan continued, I will not tie you down. You may live as you choose, at Berwick, as I see you love the land so well. You have my son, and, but the subsequent words were lost as Osrith covered his mouth with hers. It felt like a second, but at the same time, 1,000 years. After all this time, she could not still account that would marry. She loved Finan, always had done, since she had glimpsed him serving her brother honorably, unquestioningly. How he had fought with his conscience to see her, how he had drawn a line between service to Uhtred and desire for Osrith. I spoke to the king, he said when they broke away. You can remain at Berwick, as the warrior told you. Eswi, Osrith said. Eswi, he repeated. I know your dream is to farm barley. Osrith grinned, as she nudged him in the ribs. There is nothing better than barley, she quipped, then added, it is a fine living for Finan Beak. He may not make a warrior, Osrith confided. Give him to me, I will make him so, Finan told her, firmly. He can choose, Finan, it is up to him. He has not gone through the trials and difficulties we have. He does not know a lot of the world. Then, by God, you should be teaching him, Finan told her, his face stern. Osrith shook her head. Not his mother, she told Finan, thinking of the failed attempts she had had. He had thrived better with Eswi and Phelim. Boys taught by mothers grow up strangely. Can you imagine anything more demeaning? Osrith added. That is why it is difficult with Constantine. Our relationship as prince and companion was difficult enough. He has adopted him, in a fashion. The brief look on Finan's face made Osrith think she should not have said this. But young Finan followed everything Edra did. Her thoughts were interrupted when Finan put his arms around her. I remember kissing you in Winchester. I remember Uhtred being such an arseling. He told her, quietly, near her ear. I knew I loved you then, I wanted to. He kissed her. Kiss you. And Uhtred? Osrith asked. She had to know. What of him? Does he see Finan Beag as a threat? He did away with his last heir, she added, seeing his face. Our son is no threat to Bibbenberg, Finan assured her. He's more of a threat to Edra, the way he tails round after her, Osrith told him. And she is Bika and Thera's daughter, mused Finan, stroking Osrith's hair. Something good happened there. In amongst the hatred and the anger and the flames, he told her. Constantine adores her. He's spoiled her, far more than he ever did with his own two daughters. He indulges her in painting, in art, in language, all at the monastery. Finan Beag went with her, spent a lot of time there. There's something to be said for a literate warrior, Finan told her. Lady wife of the late Sainidui Alpin, Engus called officiously. Across the grounds. Osrith felt her face pink, for she should not be in such close proximity of her betrothed before they were married, and she stepped from Finan, looking towards him. Eswi was with him and they were striding towards her. Abbot Fergus has seen clear to it that a room has been made ready for you, Eswi told her, and she nodded a goodbye to Finan, next to whom Engus stood, hand on sword hilt. Finan, nevertheless made to step to Osrith. But the general pulled out his sword and held it out to Finan. It is only right and proper, Ulsterman, he growled, and Osrith turned reluctantly, Eswi accompanying her, into the monastery. Yes, it was the same room that she and Eswi had once shared when he had met her trying to come north to Dunnottar, and yes, it was the same Fergus who had been with her, with Finola and tagged when they went to Arion, to Malmuir, with Constantine and Domhnall. It is so good to see you, Abbot Fergus declared, his simple manner concealing his clear delight at meeting his comrade again. Eswi, he greeted, and shook Constantine's spy's hand. His hair was the same red as a cooling fire, just as Osrith remembered, and his love of food was beginning to show on his waistline. They clearly knew one another too. WHCH perhaps wasn't too surprising. For Finola was now Abbot Findlaith at Caerligwylad, and also Eswi's younger brother. The evening slipped away, and morning came quickly, and they were soon riding north, Engus keeping Osrith away from Finan at the front of the column, Finan following behind. They were to marry, Osrith reminded herself, Osrith, to the man she loved, and had loved for so long, and with both Uhtred's and Constantine's consent. Osrith considered that she was the happiest person alive. 88,888,888 Two figures ran across the ground from the gate of the castle as the warriors approached. One of them, A girl with hair the color of the burnished copper was easily recognizable to Osrith as Edra, the other had to be fine and big. He grinned at the warriors, who all gave him faux stony expressions and giggled at the joke. But then his face burst like the first rays of sunlight when he saw Osrith, who leaned over and pulled him onto the saddle in front of her. "What has Glymery been feeding you? You've grown so much," Osrith exclaimed, and Edra walked beside her, holding the rein as they neared Dunnotter's gate. "You have been keeping well?" Osrith asked Edra, as Eswi took the horse, helping Fine and Big down from the saddle while Osrith slid off herself. "Well," Edra nodded. "So you came at last to be married," she told her mother, and she saw a strange sight on Osrith's face as she blushed. "He has been here for a month, while Athair tried to get you to come," she added, a slightly injured tone to her voice, as if Edra herself had been personally slighted, which she might well have felt, Osrith considered. And the smile Finan gave to her would be the last she would see until tomorrow, or so whenever it was that Constantine determined the marriage to be, and she hoped that the warriors would give him a reasonable welcome. Eswi would, Osrith was sure. Young Finan had stood by his mother, shying into her arm when he saw the warrior. He remembered that he had been introduced to at Corbridge, and had been at Dunotter for some time. He was confused, because his mother had told him that this man was his Athair, when yet he knew that the king was his Athair. They walked across the courtyard to the side gate that led to the inner area of the living quarters. The tower in which young Finan was born was there, still, and Osrith looked up at it. She would stay there, she thought. She did not want the calling of the bride and the bedding ceremony or anything else unnecessary, unless Constantine insisted. "I was at Sainid's farm," Osrith told her. "They needed their lord, and when they could not have their lord, they had to make do with me. I did request you both come to live with me for a time," she added. This wasn't strictly true, but it did cause Edra's annoyed expression to dissipate. "It is lovely country," Osrith added, "close to where your grandfather Ragnar Ravnsson chose for his land." Edra rolled her eyes, sensing another rendition of her immediate ancestor's life story. "And, of course, my brother Utad took Bibbenberg." "Did he, at last?" Edra mused. Osrith frowned. "What do you mean, at last?" she asked. "I might very well have challenged for it, in fact I did challenge for it," she added. "So what stopped you from getting it?" That was her son, who was now too big, really, to be picked up, but Osrith did it anyway. Young Finan laughed. "Because I had no army," she told her son, but Edra gave her a knowing smile. "No army, and even if you had, would you really have opposed your brother?" "You ask too many questions, for a betrothed young lady," Osrith told her adopted daughter, and she saw Edra give a blush of her own. "He is fighting in Irian, but Athair says that he will come soon. And yes, I do still want to marry him," she told Osrith. They got to the door of the tower room and Edra opened the door. Young Finan ran in and made straight to the wooden toys that someone had carefully made for him, and he went to the animals and began to rearrange them. "Eswi, the captain," Edra told her, when Osrith asked. "He has a good talent, don't you think?" She held up one of the figures, carved in oak, and it was unmistakably a deer. "He has done a whole arc of Noah," she told her mother. "It is beautiful, is it not?" Indeed it was. Eswi had more than a good talent, Osrith considered. It was a fine talent, and she made a note to herself to ask him how he had learned to carve so delicately. "And when is the wedding to be?" Edra asked. Osrith shook her head. "I must speak to Constantine first," she told her daughter. She glanced to the back of the door, where the dress that Elasade and Edra had arranged for her marriage to Sainid hung. Edra followed her gaze. Elasade said she could alter it, dyed if there was time, but Osrith held up her hand. "No dresses," she told Edra. "Keep it for your own wedding, if you will, but I can never wear this again." "There will be no time to make another," Edra told her. Osrith stared at her daughter. "I will not wear one, then," she told her. "I will marry in the clothes I have, but Mathair," Edra declared, horrified. "You are going to be married." "For the 4th time in my life," Osrith told her. "And the last time." She sighed, and looked to young Finan, who was busy filing the animals into the ark, the requisite 2 at a time. "If I have to come in wearing a stable cloak, I will," but I will never wear the dress I wore when I married Sened, never." And with the impulse that had been brewing since she had begun fighting Constantine's demand she come to Dunnottar, Osrith pulled the dress from its hook and then threw it into the fire, whereupon its fine cotton threads began to curl and burn in the hearth. "Mater," Edra cried, shocked at the destruction of such a beautiful garment. And then she saw Osrith turn. "Where are you going?" "To the chapel, to pray for my sins," Osrith told her. "And I will wear what I stand up in to meet the man I love, if necessary. For a wedding is not a marriage, Edra, remember that." And with one swift kiss to young Finan's cheek, that was where Osrith made her way, pushing open the wooden door and walking in the gloom, lit only by dull, tallow candles, to the altar. She laid down buoy and tagged seeks, and the stun, the sharp, pointed knife she kept strapped to her ankle. Osrith bent her head, thoughts ungodly first filling her mind. It was the Morrigan she had been battling, since she had got back from Bibbenberg, the great queen of the Saich, who had been tormenting her, trying to drive her away from Beric, a force which Osrith had been resisting so much until just then. Let the fibers quench her eagerness for a time, she thought, as the dress burned.